Another week while Rabbi Matt is recuperating. He was recently diagnosed with a chronic form of leukemia. Don't stress out. Everything's going to be okay. It's really treatable. And you know what? We're just really grateful that he's up and around and he's moving, and we'll be back here shortly. Today, I want to talk to you about hospitality. So when I say the word hospitality, what do you think of? Let me ask you another question, or the same question in a different way. When was the last time you experienced or initiated great hospitality? So to answer this question, I think it's important to define exactly what hospitality is. It is a friendly and generous behavior towards visitors and guests intended to make them feel welcome. Hospitality is important in our culture. There are whole industries that thrive on it, like restaurants and hotels and casinos, amusement parks like Disney and Six Flags, cruise lines, and pretty much any industry that has anything to do with tourism. It has a large footprint in media as well. So there are whole magazines and books that are written about how to be hospitable. There are cable networks and a gazillion YouTube channels out there on how to be hospitable. There are even people whose names are synonymous with it. So when I say Martha Stewart, you don't think about, insider stock trading. You think about her being hospitable and all of the ways she teaches people to be hospitable. Or Rachel Ray, or Gordon Ramsay even. He might be rough around the edges, but his whole shtick is about being hospitable. And let's, not forget to mention Chip and Johanna Gaines, who are all about making your home welcoming and inviting. And there are many others who have built their names into a commercial brand that promotes hospitality. Here's some basic truths about hospitality. When you receive good or bad hospitality, you tend to remember it. And it's especially true in the restaurant business, or in people's homes, or any other business you might go to. We remember when those receiving us are welcome, and we remember when they're not. An environment lacking hospitality will drive people away, and an environment focused on hospitality will draw people to it. Either way, the effects of good or bad hospitality leave lasting impressions on us. When I think of hospitality, I think of my parents. We lived in a small row home in Trenton, New Jersey. Couldn't have been more than 1,200 square feet. And we didn't have a lot, but the house was always filled with guests. My parents made it a priority to continually invite people, who were Afghans and Turks and different people that from my dad's work and my mom's work, to come over. And sometimes, not just for dinner, but to stay the night. Sometimes it was just a family, and other times it was a lot of people. I mean, we actually, my dad's dream was to upsize his house so he could have more people come in. So again, my dad was from Afghanistan and my mom was Turkish. And their sense of hospitality reflected the cultures that they grew up in. So if you were to pay attention to travel influencers on YouTube, especially those who go to places like the Middle East or Central Asia or India or Arabia, or Latin America, or any place outside of what we'd consider the West, they always focus on two things: the food, obviously, and the hospitality that they receive. And not just because they're good, but because they're key components of how those cultures operate. The people in those cultures pride themselves on being oriented towards welcoming guests. If you traveled to these places and you were received as a guest in someone's house, you'd experience not just one kind of olive on the table, but three kinds, along with some kind of hummus or pita or other things to nosh on. If you were to stay for dinner, oftentimes there would be two kinds of entrees, just in case one of them didn't suit your tastes. Regardless of whatever your host's wealth was, you would be treated well, fed amply, and leave refreshed. That sounds a lot like my aunt's house, actually. My aunt is always like, here, eat this, here, eat this, here, eat this, when we go to visit her in Adana, Turkey. The Middle Eastern expression of hospitality is historically more in line with how it was shown in the ancient world. So hospitality in those times was less focused on entertaining people that they already knew. It was more focused on showing it to strangers and orphans and widows. It placed a premium on receiving those who were foreign or alienated from society in their homes. So the modern Western view of hospitality is less focused on strangers and more based on providing an experience. So it's like putting on a Super Bowl party for your friends. You want to make sure that they have the dip and they have the buffalo wings and they want to, they have all of the things to eat, rather than a way to extend family or community to outsiders. In his book, The Purpose-Driven Church, Rick Warren wrote that hospitality grows small churches. And this concept is true. A hospitality ministry is a valuable tool to a small congregation, whether it's coffee or donuts or a fellowship meal after services. These might seem like seemingly minor details, but they go a long way in providing people with a sense of kesher, a connectedness with the place they're in and also one another. The scriptures have a lot to say about hospitality. They show us that God himself is hospitable. By his grace, he created a world for us to inhabit. And even though we're sinners who fall short of his glory, he took a step outside of himself to make sure that we would have a place where we could thrive. In the spirit of that, he commands us to care for the outsider all throughout the Torah, and the expression of hospitality is recorded all throughout the Tanakh. In the New Covenant, hospitality had a central role in the ministry of Yeshua. Some of his miracles were rooted in God's commitment to hospitality, like the wedding of Cana, where Yeshua turned water into wine. Not grape juice, but definitely wine. And at his mother's prompting, she was like, take care of these wedding guests. And then he did. He moved. Later, he took a few fish and loaves, essentially someone's leftover lunch, and supernaturally multiplied them to feed 5,000 people, and then later 4,000 people. Before his crucifixion and resurrection, his ministry took place in the homes of his followers over meals. So some of these people were wealthy. They were tax collectors like Zacchaeus and Matthew. And others were everyday people who were committed to hosting Yeshua in their homes, like the two sisters Miriam and Martha, who were recorded as having hosted some of these meals. These were places where Yeshua taught and Yeshua lived among his followers. In his letters to Timothy and Titus, Paul required the elders of the congregations he oversaw to show hospitality to others. And in Romans 12:13, Paul wrote that followers of Yeshua should be contributing to the needs of the Kedoshim, the Lord's people, extending hospitality. When we extend hospitality to others, particularly those we don't know, it can open a door for us to be pleasing to God and a way for us to open ourselves up to deeper relationship, blessing, and revelation from God. And it can be as simple as serving somebody a prophetic cheeseburger. And that is the title of my message today. Prophetic Cheeseburgers. What is a prophetic cheeseburger, you might ask? The best way for me to explain that is in Genesis chapter 18, where Abraham showed hospitality to strangers who were passing by his tent in the heat of the day. Genesis 18, 1-5 reads, Then Adonai appeared to him at Mamre's large trees, while he was sitting in the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes to see, suddenly 3 men were standing right by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed down to the ground. Then he said, My Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. Please let there be a little water brought so you can wash your feet and make yourselves comfortable under the tree. Let me bring a bit of bread so that you can refresh yourselves. Then you can pass on, since you have passed by your servant. They said, Do just as you have said. So in ancient times, travelers would get up really early and walk until they hit the heat of midday and then look for a place to stay. So Abraham is sitting by the entry of his tent, and that's where the breeze would come in. And he's comfortable, And as you can imagine, it's crazy hot outside. It's like crazy Middle Eastern hot outside. He leaves his comfortable place and he runs out to meet them. And he humbles himself before these strangers and offers to take them into his house. And he offers to take care of their needs, saying, let me refresh you, get cleaned up. Let me give you something to eat and a place to rest until you're ready to move along. So we can see Abraham demonstrating selflessness. He's lowly, he's humble, and he's putting the needs of others before his own, and honestly, above his own comfort and convenience. So then in verses 6 through 7, it says, Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quick, knead 3 measures of fine flour and prepare bread loaves. Then Abraham ran to the herd and took a young ox, tender and good, and he gave it to the servant who prepared it quickly. So Abraham went into the tent, essentially, and said, cheeseburgers! We need cheeseburgers! We need cheeseburgers for these guests. And then someone in the back shouted, I has cheeseburgers! And thus, cat memes were born. Yes, that's right. I love that joke. Listen, baking bread during that time of the day isn't done. It's just simply too hot. They would either make it very early in the morning or right before the evening meal. They would have only had enough to get them through the day. And what Abraham decides is to make a commitment to making sure his guests didn't just experience hospitality, but that they experienced it with excellence. So he tells them to fire up the coals. It doesn't matter how hot it is, to make these people bread. He puts an importance on them and what they need. Then in the heat of the day, he, not a servant, at 90 years old, runs all the way to where his herd is, and he gets an ox. And he ran all the way to the flock in the heat of the day. So this is important just because I want you to understand that meat is valuable, right, in the Middle East. Even to this day, it's expensive. And you didn't eat it every day. Maybe Abraham did, but certainly his whole household didn't. And if guests came, you gave them the best of what you had. So Abraham's effort to go get an ox, and oxen are actually really important in the Bible because they're offered up as peace offerings. And, you know, they provide a lot of things. They plow. And Abraham takes essentially the best and the most valuable of what he has, and he brings it to these men. In verse 8, he says, then he took butter and milk and the young ox that he had prepared before them and set it before them. While he was standing by them under the tree, they ate. Yes, God fed Abraham milk and meat. And a lot of our more Orthodox friends would be, you know, kind of appalled by this. But this is what the text said, that God fed Abraham milk and meat. There wasn't a 4-hour gap in between them. So essentially, God fed Abraham. Abraham fed God, essentially, the first cheeseburger. And he stood there the whole time, not sitting. He stood over them like a waiter. And it doesn't even say that he ate with them. He wanted to make sure that they had everything that they needed while taking the posture of a waiter or a maitre d'. When they were eating, God continued to speak to Abraham. So it says in verses 9 through 10, then they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, there, in the tent. Then he said, I will most surely, and I want you to understand that he is in capital letters here because there's a revelation at the beginning of the chapter that this is God in the flesh. So then he said, I will most surely return to you in about a year's time. Surprisingly, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Sarah was listening to him at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. And the story that follows is Sarah laughs in her heart because she says, Abraham and I are too old to have kids, and God kind of calls her out on it and says, you know, you're laughing. And then they, you know, as a joke, name the kid Isaac, laughter. So this passage shows us Abraham's humility and hospitality. And his hospitality opened the door for deeper revelation, for deeper blessing, and for deeper relationship with God. Abraham's relationship with God deepened because Abraham's willingness to step outside of his comfortable place to engage these strangers opened up an encounter with God, one that led him to meet God in the flesh, a pre-incarnate version of Yeshua in an up-close and personal way over a meal. Listen, It's crazy. This is the first time. It's like, I need you to understand this moment. It's like meeting a friend on Facebook or social media and making friends with this person and then finally meeting them in person. You know, Abraham went from just hearing the voice of God to experiencing the presence of God in a more real and powerful way than he ever had. Abraham experienced God's blessing, and honestly, it's as if God's presence wasn't enough. The Lord brought some receipts, right? He said, in a year, the heir I promised you will be here. The reward for Abraham's faithfulness wasn't just, all right, God, good and faithful servant. It was to experience God's faithfulness through his miraculous provision. Listen, this isn't just a run-of-the-mill miracle, if there is such a thing. It was a supernatural visitation from God that resulted in God glorifying himself and blessing Abraham with a legacy that exists even to this day. We can see how Abraham experienced revelation later in verses 16 through 18. Then, it says, then the men got up from there and looked down over Sodom. Abraham was walking with them to send them off, when Adonai said, should I keep secret from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham will most certainly become a great and mighty nation, and in him all of the nations will be blessed. For I have made myself known to him, so that he will follow my commands, and that his sons and his household after him will keep the way of Adonai by doing righteousness and justice, so that Adonai may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. You see, God took time to reveal to Abraham his plans to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. He's giving him a heads up, and he's essentially saying, listen, this is what's coming, not just in your life, but in the world around you. I need you to understand that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was a real event, and to Abraham it would have looked like an apocalyptic scene, like the end of the world was near. And this is exactly why God chose to reveal his plans at that moment. To Abraham, it would have been like Armageddon was happening. And what God is saying to Abraham is that his future is secure, even though the world around him would be going through a massive turmoil. It's God's way of reaffirming not just his promise to Abraham for the future, but also reminding him that God is at work in his presence, his present at well, and to not fear anything that might jeopardize the promises of God that he had said would come to pass. So, what does this mean for us? If God decided he was going to deepen relationship with Abraham and to bless him and reveal his plans to him, how does that affect us? For the answer to that, let's look in Acts 2, chapter 24. Acts 2, verses 42 through 47. It says, they were devoting themselves to the teaching of the emissaries and to fellowship, to breaking bread and to prayers. Fear lay upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were happening through the emissaries. And all who believed were together, having everything in common. They began selling their property and possessions and sharing them with all as any had need. Day by day, they continued in one mind, spending time at the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They were sharing meals with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And every day the Lord was adding to their number those being saved. This text shows us that Yeshua's disciples experienced the same deepened relationship, blessing, and revelation from God that Abraham did. But within the context of congregational life and hospitality. As they ate together, they grew together. They grew as disciples. They learned more about God, who he was, and the path that they were all set upon, and what they were called to be. They were disciples who were expressing their relationship to God, with God, by loving one another, the way that Yeshua had loved them. See, what God revealed to them in this season of them all being together was one of the great spiritual mysteries of the entire Bible. That there is no love greater than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that God's biggest blessing to them was him showing them how to be a blessing to each other. Friends, this goes beyond signs and wonders, and although that is certainly part of it, their lives became rooted in God and based on unity and friendship and togetherness in the name of the Lord in a way that we can strive to achieve. The best thing of all is that it spent more time around being together, honestly, usually eating something. And showing hospitality in their homes to one another became a way to allow God's love to become an attractional force that drew others outside of the family of God to it. So I believe that God wants all of us to learn to be hospitable in ways that help us grow as disciples and to lead others into his kingdom. So you might be asking yourself, well, how do I do that? I'm a currently rehabilitating Messianic rabbi, and rabbis always answer a question with a question. My question to you is, do you have a welcoming spirit? See, hospitality isn't just feeding people and cleaning and making sure the house is ready and making sure that they have some kind of experience. It's more than that. It goes deeper than that. The question I want to ask you is, are you approachable? Do you feel like people can approach you? What does your body language say when you're around strangers? Are you hiding behind a cell phone? In Seattle, talking to strangers can be a very awkward thing. People act really weird. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from New Jersey. You can go up to a stranger usually and just start, shooting the breeze, and they'll sit there and talk to you and they'll engage you. But here, the cell phones come out and people act super awkward when you're at the door. And usually there's this kind of like a barrier to just kind of relating and emoting to one another. My next question would be, are you relational? Are you the kind of person who can step out of yourself and honestly make an effort to engage with others? See, when we engage others with the expectation that we're trying to not just engage them for our sake, but that we're taking a step towards opening doors of relationship and blessing and revelation, not just for ourselves, but for others. We're taking a step towards helping people who aren't in relationship with Yeshua and becoming gateways of hospitality and friendship that help them enter into the family of God. Friends, I believe that if we take that step, God is going to show up in ways that we can't fathom. He will open doors to his kingdom that no man can shut. This is our calling as disciples of Yeshua, to be in his family and to invite others into it, and to hand out a few prophetic cheeseburgers along the way. Let me pray for you. Lord, I just ask that you would help us to become welcoming people, that you would help us to become a people who are able to relate and able to emote and able to take a step outside of that awkwardness that we might feel. Help our body language to be warm and inviting. Help us to understand that hospitality is one way that we can reach the world around us, that we can draw other people into your kingdom, a way that we as believers in Yeshua can express the unconditional love of God to one another, but also a way where that expression can become an attractional force, where people will long and hunger for that expression and be drawn to it like moths to a flame. In Yeshua's name, amen.